Rob. Rob, there we go. Okay, and you may need to unmute.
Good. Okay.
There you are. Yep.
Why it started on the last slide, I don't know, but we'll figure it out.
No worries.
Huh. Okay. So I'm Rob Over. I'm Chief Platform Architect for NVIDIA's data center products. And this is a bit of a manifesto, and it started out with a question I was asked, which is, do you think OAM is appropriate for HPC? And the conversation ended up taking a very different turn. So let's talk through that a bit. I wanted to start, I know we all know AI is exploding, you know, it's in the news all the time, but I wanted to take a minute and really focus on this. So almost anybody who's tracking this is seeing that the computational complexity, the size complexity, the the scale of AI workloads is really expanding about 10x year on year. So if you think about that, that's about 2x complexity expansion about every 3 to 4 months. That is pretty mind-boggling. And this is really important because what it says to you is if you design something today, and then by the time you build it, it is probably going to be woefully incapable. And so you really have to plan ahead and predict what you're going to need a long time out. And the reason this is important is because HPC and AI are really emerging as disciplines today. We're seeing clusters, GPU clusters for accelerated computing. 4K GPUs in a cluster is actually becoming common. I mean, it's not, you know, everybody doesn't have that, but it's pretty common. And AI is now being used in a lot of the national labs and in private cases for replacing or enhancing HPC algorithms and domains. So, you know, a lot of things in, protein folding is a great example, but there are a lot of algorithmic portions that are being replaced by AIs. And an example of how these areas are fused is our own latest cluster, which we built up in, it's kind of cool, 3 weeks. That is number 7 in the top 500. And the same cluster is number 1 in the MLPerf results for most areas. So again, a real merging of these domains. And the evolution is happening rapidly too. So for example, important workloads tend to be obsoleted about every 6 months. On top of that, software tuning on stable workloads tends to double the throughput every year. So the growth in computational capability and density and throughput is pretty astonishing. But it's worth noting that AI also has a slightly different profile from traditional HPC. It's much more iterative. It's convergent algorithms. You approach the resolving solution, and it has asymptotic scaling. So it doesn't really linearly scale very well. This is not scale out architecture. It has to be dense, and this forces a lot of architectural choices. The impact on the hardware is pretty significant. It really favors dense, accelerated, heavy computing. And there are a lot of good reasons behind that: shared memory, for different workloads, and the requirement for a strong CPU affinity. And it's very, very communication heavy. And this is not average bandwidth. This is memory transactions, very small packets, very latency sensitive. And you tend to be working outside of the optimal network communication domain. And the communication algorithms tend to be different as well. But high bandwidth and low latency are critical requirements. And by high bandwidth, I mean pretty extreme bandwidth. So the one of the things I would ask OCP, in really thinking about HPC is this rapid innovation and evolution means that that innovation can't be blocked. It can't be blocked by static decisions and choices that are being made. So the architecture needs to focus on the future, and by future I mean many years out. Otherwise, the hardware will be obsolete by the time it's landed. And it's also worth knowing that today's workloads will be obsolete. So over-optimizing is also problematic because the important algorithm is probably not, it doesn't exist yet today. That means you almost have to innovate from the cluster architecture down. And so, the rack hardware, the cooling, the power to facilitate density, fabrics and bandwidth, latency, the communication libraries and stacks all need to be optimized and tuned. And again, the communication forces density. And then you need to be optimizing for inter-accelerator communication, different interfaces, different memory models. And in truth, the cluster software and multi-tenancy needs to take front and center as well. So what's really needed is a very large innovation zone to an architecture at the cluster level. And my point really was that an OEM module, as awesome as it is such a low level of definition. And it's so constrained on its IO model and power and the assumption set that's made, that it's just far, far, far too low a level calcification of standards to enable innovation. And so I guess you would say this is my call to action here. I think OCP is phenomenally capable of providing some of the critical things. One is power and power density. Obviously 54 volt nominal, the 48 volt standard is incredibly useful. And cooling needs to happen, certainly in the multi-tens of kilowatts per rack, preferably 100 kilowatts per rack or more. I know that's difficult, but it's probably necessary. And that enables very dense communication and memory pooling. The rack infrastructure is really critical too. For example, having standard racks that enable all the cabling, liquid cooling plenums, for example, heat exchangers for liquid to air. All these things are critical, and by providing the infrastructure, it's a huge enabler. And then building the communication infrastructure, a lot of photonics, they're incredibly dense switching, like OCP has been pioneering, and low latency networking infrastructure are all really critical. So that's what I would ask the HPC work group to really focus on, is enable the innovation. Don't block it, please. And that's really it for me.